Well, I'm going to talk about the missing in action from the Pacific War, obviously, from what's on the screen. I consider this a work in progress, and it sort of grew out of the research I did on some of my earlier books, because I was doing a lot of oral history interviews with people who were involved in the war, and I kept hearing stories about, oh, well, so-and-so was killed in a firefight. We had to keep moving, and for whatever reason, Graves registration either lost the body or misplaced it, and the families were notified that they were missing in action rather than killed in action. And there's all sorts of stories, too, of planes taking off maybe from an aircraft, carry on a routine patrol, but maybe the pilot's navigation wasn't too good and he couldn't make it back to the ship. And in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands area, they think that there's somewhere between 500 and 600 missing aircraft just in the greater Papua Solomon Islands area, and most all of them are from World War II. You have to remember, though, too, that we were manufacturing planes as fast as we could, and as fast as we could manufacture planes, we were training people to fly those planes. And I remember interviewing a fellow who flew B-24s during the war, and he said, well, they taught me how to take off, and they taught me how to land, and after that, it was up to me to figure the rest out. So it was on-the-job training. And of course, as fast as they were building planes and training people to maintain them as well, there were a lot of accidents where planes were lost for what they called operational reasons, maybe mechanical failure, poor navigation, poor pilot skills, whatever. So I think it's fair to say that the majority of aircraft lost in World War II were not the result of combat, but more as a result of what they called operational losses. And I thought for a long time that Papua New Guinea had probably the greatest number of missing aircraft than any place else in the world. And then last year I was reading a book about the Himalaya Mountains. Because in those days, we were flying stuff from India over the Himalayas to China originally to keep the Chinese in the war. We didn't want them to give up or surrender. And then the first B-29s to fly against Japan were actually flown to India over the hump into China. And a lot of those planes were lost. According to the information I have, something like 700 aircraft went down in the Himalayas, either going to China or to India. The people who flew the hump referred to it as the aluminum trail. So this, like I said, it's an ongoing work that I'm doing. I'm getting new information. I'm working on new cases. I find new information. So I'm constantly changing the lecture. The problem is when you have to keep a lecture to less than an hour, you can only say so much. So I'm always taking things out if I want to put something new in. And I also lecture to a lot of Australian and New Zealand audiences. So having moved to New Zealand, I took an interest in their MIA cases, and I've added some to my lecture. But this is mostly a North American audience, and I just don't have enough time to discuss them. So I've taken all those cases and moved them to the very end of my lecture. And I'll see if I can touch on one or two of them, but if I'm close to 45 minutes, I'm going to have to just skip over that part. But how many people have been to Punch Bowl Cemetery? Okay, when you drive in there, you know that there's the cemetery, and you drive in, the graves are right and left, but if you keep going all the way to the back, you'll see these marble structures. Has anybody spent any time looking over those? Okay, a few of you have. On these marble structures are listed all of the Americans who've gone missing in action in the Pacific War, and there's quite a number of them. And I'm going to use this graph to show you. This is put out by the DPAA, that's the Defense POW MI Accounting Agency. Now, they have offices in Washington, D.C., but at Pearl Harbor, very close to Hickam Field, that's where their headquarters are for the Pacific, and that's where all the historians and forensic anthropologists work. That's where they have their laboratories. That's where remains that are found are brought back there for analysis, and they put together this graph. And if you look on the far right, this is the number of Americans who are still listed as missing in action from all of our recent wars going back to World War II. And then if you look to the far left, that's how many Americans are still listed as missing in action from World War II alone. It's over 73,000. So you can understand why this is a work in progress, not just for me, but for DPAA and a lot of the individuals and groups that I have been networking with and working with over the years. In fact, quite often when I go to Honolulu, I get together with some of my colleagues at DPA. We just get together for lunch or coffee, whatever, and I just swap notes. I just tell them what I've come up with, and then they kind of share with me some of the field projects that they've been doing or have lined up. So hopefully when we get to Honolulu, I'll be able to meet with them again while I'm there. But again, I like to use a map, and that's how vast the battlefield was. I mean, it was mostly ocean, and the red parts, that's how far the Japanese got in the first 6 months of the war. And I don't know if I told you this before, but I like to use maps for another reason, because there was some years ago that American high school students were tested on their knowledge of geography, and one of the surprising results from that examination was that over 50% of them thought they lived in Brazil. So I don't know if any of you flunked geography in high school, but just in case, you'll see me using quite a few maps in my lecture. I'm going to go up the Mariana Islands first, because that's where I lived for 5 years. That's where I researched and wrote my first book. And it's also where I started hearing stories about people who got killed or went missing. And I'm going to give you some examples of those right now. But here's a close-up of the Mariana Islands. It runs roughly north to south. The biggest and the oldest are on the south. Guam has been a U.S. territory since the Spanish-American War. It's still a territory. We have Anderson Air Force Base there. We have Navy facilities, and actually we're building up those facilities as I speak because of the threat from China. But the northern part from Rota up, that was left to Spain initially, and then Spain sold them to Germany in 1899 because they were bankrupt after the Spanish-American War. But I lived on Saipan, just to the north of Tinian. Tinian is just to the south there in 1945, as I think I've mentioned before, was the biggest and busiest airport in the world at the time, because that's where the B-29s were flying off Tinian. A couple of airstrips on Saipan, later Guam, to take the war home to Japan. I got from the official Marine Corps history of the Battle of Saipan. And if you look down on the lower left-hand side, that's where the two Marine Corps divisions landed, the 2nd Marine Division to the north, 4th Marine Division to the south on yellow and blue beaches. And then later, elements of the 27th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, were brought ashore. Now, for people who have studied the Battle of Saipan, this photograph on the left is considered an iconic photograph because this is 15 June 1944. This is D-Day on Saipan. And one of the people I interviewed, Carl Matthews, who was in the 4th Marine Division, he's pretty sure that he is in the photograph there. And the guy standing behind him is a freshly minted 2nd lieutenant. See, the 4th Marine Division had saw combat in the Marshalls. After the Marshalls were secured, they were sent back to Hawaii to take on some replacement troops and get some more training before their next operation, which was Saipan. And so Mr. Leary standing in back there, that was his first taste of combat. That was 15 June, and they had landed on the beach, and they were shooting at them. But Carl thought it was pretty sure that he was in there, and that the guy to his right was Wendell Nightingale, a BAR man, a Browning automatic rifle. So a friend of mine did a little bit of Photoshop on it and blew it up, and we showed that to Carl. He is 100% sure that that is him on the left, and this is Wendell Nightingale on the right. Now later in the fighting, when the 4th Marine Division moved over to the east side of the island, and they were pushing north with the 2nd Marine Division pushing north on the west coast, and the 27th Infantry Division pushing them up in the middle, they came across an open ground. There was a stone wall there behind, and they had to cross this open area, and then there was a a coconut grove in the distance. Well, they didn't know the Japanese were dug in there. So they got halfway across the open area, the Japanese opened up. A number of the people in his company were shot and killed. Wendell Nightingale was shot and wounded, and one of his buddies ran back to try to get his body. But before he got there, the Japanese shot and killed him, so he had to rush back behind the stone wall. And that's when they called in some artillery support to reduce the where the Japanese were dug in the coconut grove before they could move forward. Well, they knew Nightingale was dead, but they couldn't stop. They just stuck his gun in the ground, assuming Graves registration would come along, recover his body, identify him, and notify his family that it was killed in action. But, Graves registration, I think, was a hit-and-miss operation during the war. Because like everything else in the military, we had to recruit people. A lot of them were African-American troops, not all of them, to be part of Graves registration. And so some were better trained than others. But in the case of Wendell Nightingale, instead of notifying that his family that he was killed in action, they were notified that he was missing in action. It wasn't until after the war when some of his surviving buddies could notify the family, said, look, he was killed, we know he was dead. They still to this day do not know what happened to his body. And this is James Stanley Leary. I just mentioned him as being a freshly minted second lieutenant. He was a replacement officer that joined the 4th Division in Hawaii and then made his first combat landing on Saipan. Carl Matthews was his runner, so they were glued at the hip from the day they landed until the end of the fighting. Now, later, as they had got towards the north end of the island and they had pretty much pushed the Japanese up there, they had crossed from the east side over the mountains, the hills, to the left side. They were on high ground looking down towards the plain on the west side towards the north end, observing the activity of some Japanese down there, not knowing that there were other Japanese right nearby. They opened up on both Carl Matthews and Mr. Leary. According to Carl Matthews, Stanley Leary was killed instantly. Carl Matthews managed to scramble out of the way, but 2 other Marines were killed trying to recover Mr. Leary's body. So they didn't want to lose any more men trying to recover their dead, and the fighting was getting pretty intense, so they had to back out. So again, this is a situation where they knew he was killed, but the family is notified that he was missing in action. So it was later, after Carl Matthews had been wounded and was sent back to the States, he had contact with Mr. Leary's family to let them know for sure what happened. But I think it was 2004, during the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Saipan, I went back. I'd been there for the 50th, so I was there for the 60th and the 70th anniversary. But on the 60th, I took Carl Matthews back with me. He had never been back there since the war. And based on the date this happened and the history I had on the 4th Marine Division, I had a pretty good idea as to where it was. So we drove up there. It had all grown over with tangan and another jungle growth, but there were enough physical features in the area that Carl Matthews could recognize as the place where they got in the firefight and where Mr. Leary and 2 other Marines lost their lives. We searched the area as best we could, trying to find any skeletal remains, but never found them. One possibility is that when the Japanese started coming back in the 60s and 70s to recover their dead, they might easily have scooped up the remains of those Marines, cremated them, and taken back to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. I'll cover more about that in just a few minutes. But this is the old Japanese jail. There on Saipan. It's a bit of a ruin there, but there are a number of Americans who were held there during the war. I think it was either in April, maybe in May. There was a B-24 photo reconnaissance mission that flew over Saipan and some of the other islands, trying to get some photographic intelligence before the planned landings there in June of 1944. One of the B-24s was shot down and crashed off the coast. There were 4 survivors, and they were taken to this jail. I know this because one of the people I interviewed was Manny T. Sablon. As a young lad, he was a messenger boy for the Japanese police, and he remembers seeing them there, remember taking them food. But in his oral history interview, he said that the Japanese said, well, after interrogation, they were going to put them on ships and send them back to Japan. But I really doubt that they made it, because by that time in the war, orders from Tokyo were to execute all captured Allied airmen. So that was not 100% the case in all cases, but it happened quite often. So the possibility is that when they took them out of the jail, maybe they took them someplace and executed them. Or if they did put them on ships going back to Japan, the possibility of them not making it that way is real, because the Allied submarines were right off the coast of Saipan and the rest of the northern Mariana Islands, and they were sinking ships trying to bring reinforcements and supplies to Saipan, as well as ships that were trying to evacuate civilians back to Japan. So if they were put on one of those ships, it's very likely, though, that that ship was sunk and they never made it back to Japan. Now, there's the case of J.J. Perry, because there were two other airmen held there. During the softening up period prior to the landings on 15 June 1944, ships and carrier aircraft were trying to soften up the island. So a lot of carrier aircraft, dive bombers, and fighter planes were bombing and strafing the island. Some of those planes were shot down. At least I know of two cases where two fighter pilots of a carrier were shot down over the island. They were captured and they were held in the prison. I know this again because of the interview I did with Manny T. Sablon. He said he saw them, he talked to them even though he couldn't speak English. He said one of them was wounded. He said later, though, one of the pilots in the jail was killed by friendly fire when an American fighter aircraft strafed the area. The other one was taken out on 15 June as the Marines were landing, and he was decapitated. Now, as the Marines were moving up the west coast of the island, they got to the main village of Garapan, which is very close to where the Japanese jail was. They found his remains. And he had a flight jacket on it, and it had the name J.J. Perry stenciled in it. So I sent this information to a friend of mine in the U.S. His name is Ted Darcy. He's a retired Marine gunnery sergeant. But with the retirement, he took an interest in American KIAs and MIAs. And I said, do you know anything about a J.J. Perry? Do you have anything in your database? And he says, there's only one J.J. Perry I have listed, but he was a radio man on a B-24 that was shot down in the Marshall Islands in October 1943. And I said, well, they found this body there with his flight jacket on it. And he says, yeah, that's a bit of a mystery. Apparently, though, that B-24 squadron also were flying missions on the Mariana Islands later. But supposedly, though, the body was that of a fighter pilot, but we don't know for sure. But I stayed in contact with Ted about this, and he eventually sent me this photo. It's not a very good one, but he says, these are the survivors of the B-24 that was shot down in the Marshall Islands in October 1943. And you can't see it very well, but they're all holding little wooden signs with something written in Japanese. And according to Ted Darcy, soon after this photograph was taken out, they were all taken out and executed. So the mystery is, well, who was this guy found outside the Japanese jail with this flight jacket of J.J. Perry? Again, according to Ted Darcy, J.J. Perry was a radio man on that B-24. And it was not unusual for the Japanese to take radio men and install them in a wireless station and help them monitor American radio traffic. And they did have a wireless station on Saipan. I've actually found remnants of it when I was living there. So it's very possible that he was kept alive and used in that capacity, but to this day we still do not know for sure. And what about Japanese MIAs? Well, they lost millions of people during the fighting, and they couldn't recover their dead for the most part. But in the 1960s, into the 70s, they started coming back to some of these Pacific War battlefields and at least trying to recover the remains of people who were killed out there. And when I was exploring these two little hills north of Mount Tapachaw, which is the highest point in the island, we came across what looked like the remains of 4 different individuals, and we're pretty sure that they were all Japanese because of the artifacts that were with them, such as the style of hand grenades and other equipment. Now, we did find this one who was intact. Apparently, he had died there. There was no place to bury him, so they basically covered rocks over him. But one of his femurs was sticking out, so we took all the rocks off, and we had an entire skeleton there. And he had some personal items on them, such as his toothbrush and toothbrush holder. He had a Japanese style hand grenade somewhere near his hip, but he also had the equivalent of Japanese dog tags. So I had a friend in Tokyo who had a translation service, so I made copies of both sides of the dog tags, and I sent them to him. And I said, Hiro-san, can you make anything out of this? Can you identify the individual or give me some more information? And he says, well, basically, from what I've gleaned from the dog tags, is that he wasn't even supposed to be on Saipan. He was supposed to be someplace in the Solomon Islands or maybe the Papua New Guinea area. And the only thing I can think of is that during this time of this period in the war, 1944, a lot of ships heading for certain islands or island groups were being sunk mostly by submarines, but also by carrier aircraft. And survivors would then be picked up by other ships and taken to the nearest Japanese-held island. So it's very possible he may have been on his way someplace else when his ship was sunk, and he ended up on Saipan. I know quite a few Japanese, whether they were heading for the Mariana Islands or some other island group, had their ships sunk before they got there. And survivors ended up on Saipan with only the clothes on their back, but without any of their equipment. So that's another mystery. But in July 1944, as the Japanese had been pushed up towards the north end of the island, General Saito, who was a senior Japanese army commander on the island, was in a little valley up towards the north, along with Admiral Nagomo, as I had mentioned. He led the carrier attack on Pearl Harbor, and then also was in command of the carrier task force that attacked Midway later in June 1942. But he was also on Saipan because he was pretty much sent there without much of a fleet because of his failure at Midway. And that's where they ordered a Gyokusai, or a Banzai charge. This was in July 1944. They knew the game was up. They passed the word verbally, basically, because they had lost all their communications, and ordered all surviving Japanese to attack the Americans. And they attacked in driblets because the word had to be passed around by mouth. But when it was all over, both Saito and Nagomo committed suicide. And according to a friend of mine who lives on the island, some years ago, a Japanese veteran who came back there said they buried Nagomo someplace up in that valley. I'll have more to say about that later. But after the Gyokusai, they counted over 4,000 dead Japanese, and it was summer. This was July. They had to bury them quick because a lot of the people I'd interviewed in the war said it was really hot in summer, and in the first few days of the fighting, so many people got killed so quick that you could actually smell blood in the air. But after a few days, then, a lot of decomposition took place, and instead of smelling blood, you just smelled the decomposition of all these thousands bodies that were left laying out. And even though they tried to recover them, especially the Americans, they tried to recover them as fast as possible, and they set up a number of temporary cemeteries on the southwest end of the island, and some were taken out and buried at sea. But people I'd interviewed said, but the smell was so horrible, and there were these big black flies, and they were feasting on all these cadavers. And when you had a break and you tried to eat your sea rations, these flies would come off the cadavers and land on your food. So, I try to sanitize my lectures as much as possible, but I can't include the sounds of battle, and I can't include the smells of what's going on in a combat situation. I can verbalize them to you, and as unpleasant as it is, but I think that's just part of what you have to accept when you're going to go to war. War is not a screenplay written in Hollywood. It's a real event. But anyway, I came across, they had to bury these bodies in mass graves. They took bulldozers and dug these trenches and then dumped the bodies in and covered them back over. And I found this old photograph. It's not the best, but if you look real close, you can see a bulldozer digging a trench. Okay? And then off to the left, all these bodies. And then they would just be unceremoniously dumped into the trench and covered up. But then in 1994, just the year before I arrived in Saipan, the Japanese were going to build a hotel in this area called Achugo. It's near the village of Achugo. And they're doing some test bores before starting construction of the hotel there. They kept coming up with these skeletal remains. So they stopped, notified the Japanese consulate. The consulate sent in what we called the bone hunters in those days. They went out there and did what you see here in reverse. We took a bulldozer, scraped away all the tang and other growth that was there, and then just started scraping dirt off a few inches at a time until we came across skeletal remains. And then we went in with hand tools and dug them out that way. So they're all mixed up. It was very difficult to find any personal artifacts that would identify them so family members could be identified. And they counted, they think, the remains of over 500 individuals. But there are more mass graves in the area that haven't been uncovered yet. I better go back. And these are just some of the people who came out from Japan. Because after we excavated this mass grave, I took them out to places in the jungle where I had uncovered other skeletal remains. So I spent about a week with these people. But what they do is there was an old fighter strip on the north end of the island that the Japanese started building, and then the Americans finished, and P-47s flew out of there afterwards. But they would take these skeletal remains to what was left of that old fighter strip, and they would cremate them and then take them back to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Actually, it's a cemetery near there. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. But that's where all the remains of Japan's war dead are taken. But like I said, they weren't very careful in identifying remains to make sure they were Japanese. I mean, if they would find skeletal remains, the assumption was they were Japanese. But there are any number of missing Americans, and there are a lot of missing locals who disappeared during the war and were never found. So I think it's quite possible that at the Yasukuni Shrine, there are probably the cremated remains of Americans, Australians, and even Pacific Islanders who were included in there. But in recent years now, at the Historic Preservation Office, at least in Saipan, if the Japanese come back to recover more of their war dead, they have to be pretty sure that they are Japanese and make sure they haven't dug up the grave of some local who died centuries ago, or maybe they even come across the remains of some American who disappeared during the fighting and was listed as missing in action. I'm going to talk a little bit about Woody Lackland McVeigh. He was an F-6F Hellcat pilot off my old ship, Yorktown, CV-10. After the marshals had been declared secure, and they didn't secure all the marshals, that would have taken forever. Basically, we would go into an island group, seize islands that might have a nice lagoon, or the Japanese had built an airstrip, or it was a good place for the Seabees to build an airstrip. And this was under Admiral Spruance, and Admiral Mark Mitchener, who was in charge of the fast carriers, he was then sent out to neutralize some of the other islands in the Marshalls, especially the ones that had airstrips, because they didn't have to worry about after seizing an island or an island group and then having Japanese on some of the other nearby atolls coming in and trying to disrupt things. And then as an afterthought, he sent Admiral Mitchener further west to the Caroline Islands to take out the main Japanese base there on the island of Truk. As a matter of fact, it's a favorite diving spot for a lot of people there. They go out there and dive these old ships that the Americans had sunk there in the Truk Lagoon. And then, maybe as an afterthought, this was February 1944. This is several months before the landings were to take place on Saipan. Mark Mitchener took his fast carriers up there, and they bombed and strafed Saipan and nearby Tinian. He lost 7 aircraft during this operation. The 7th managed to make a crash landing back on his carriers, but the other ones were shot down, including Woody Lackland McVeigh and his wingman. Now, we don't know if they had a mid-air collision or whether they got shot down, but after the Marines landed on Saipan and the 2nd Marine Division was moving up the west coast and they got close to the main village of Garapan, some locals came out and told some of the Marines that there was an American aviator buried in a civilian cemetery over there. So they got a doctor and some medics and they went there. They exhumed the remains there. I did an autopsy on it. They found remnants of his clothing that had his name stenciled in it, and they took dental records. And then, see, the family had been notified back in February that he was missing in action. And even though they uncovered his grave here and identified him as Woody Lackland McVeigh, somewhere along the line, they failed to inform the family that they had recovered his body. Now, back in the 90s, when I was researching my first book, there's only so much you could get off the internet. So I was writing to College Park, Maryland, telling them what I'm doing. I'm looking for information on this and information on that. And they were sending me boxes and bags full of stuff. A lot of it I couldn't use, but I kept for future research. And one of the things they sent me that I didn't fit in with my research was the autopsy report. They found that I had the autopsy report in the National Archives. So I made a copy of this and sent it to Ted Darcy. And he was familiar with the case. And he spent the next 3 years researching this. And he finally found the remains of Woody Lackland McVeigh in the American Memorial Cemetery in Manila. He notified DPAA. They exhumed the remains. And through whatever method they used, they positively identified him as that. So this is 65 years after the fact. His wife was still alive, but she had remarried. I think he had a baby daughter. I don't know if you ever saw her, but she had died somewhere. But he had a granddaughter and other family members there. So they were notified that they had finally found his remains 65 years later. So 65 years later, they had his funeral. Now, I took this information and I wrote it up for an article. It was published in the Naval History magazine some years ago. And if you go on my website, under articles, I have all these articles that I've written besides books. They're there, so you don't have to go find it. It's on my website, and it's voicesfromthepacificwar.com, or you can go on Google and type Bruce M. Petty. If you leave the M out, you're going to get a political cartoonist from Australia. And you're going to be frustrated. So that was, this is one of those things that I was familiar with, I've been working on, and wow, we solved one of those cases. Now, DPA is working day in and day out, and they're solving cases as we go along. They're even exhuming bodies recovered from the USS Oklahoma that was sunk at Pearl Harbor. And now with some of their DNA and other techniques, they're able to take these unknowns, most of them buried in punch bowl, and they're being able to identify them and notify next of kin. Of course, we're talking about second, third generation in most cases. And also, if you go on Facebook, if you want to follow what DPA is doing, just go search DPAA. And they're posting stuff on Facebook all the time. Okay. We're looking at an Avenger bomber. The guy in the middle, his name is Holloman. I'm still in contact with his son down in, I think it was Louisiana someplace. He was the pilot of an Avenger bomber off the Gambier Bay. That was a small aircraft carrier. The fellow on the left is Howard Rivers from Ohio. I'm still in contact with his niece. The fellow on the right is Jack Bacon from Portland, Oregon. He was an orphan. For a long time, I had contact with one of his high school classmates. She's long gone, though. But this is 17 June, 1944. The Marines and the Army had landed just 2 days earlier. We're getting up towards the northwest end of the island. The main village of Garapan would be off to the left. This is Tanapeg Harbor, a little islet out there in the lagoon called Managaha. No, Managaha? I think it's Managaha. But anyway, inland near the Japanese lighthouse, they thought there was a suspected Japanese ammunition dump. So Halloran and his crew were ordered to go and bomb it. And in the process of bombing it, they took an anti-aircraft shell into the bomb bay, set the plane on fire. Marines nearby said they saw 2 parachutes come out. But Halloran, even though badly burned, managed to crash land on the reef out there by Managaha. And he was later rescued, but he was badly burned, and that was the end of the war for him. And Gambier Bay was later sunk off Leyte, off Samar Island in October 1944. But we never found the remains of Rivers or Bacon. And one of the people, a former Seabee I had contact with, and said he had a friend who was a Navy photographer's mate off one of the ships. And after Saipan was declared secure, he was sent ashore to take photographs of the remains of Americans who had been captured and killed by the Japanese. So I got a hold of him by phone. I started talking to them, and I said, how many photographs did you take? And he says, I can't remember, but there were quite a few. But he had been badly injured later in the war, and he's one of these guys who was trying to forget the war. He didn't want to really talk about it, and then somebody like me comes along, and I'm asking him to remember things he's been trying to forget. So I got a minimal amount of information out of him, but he started getting a bit emotional, and he really didn't want to go over that again. So we stopped. But I notified Ted Darcy. I said, I talked to this guy. He says he took all these photographs. Maybe you can go to the Navy Historical Society or something. See if you can find, I'm probably not very pleasant photographs to look at, but it might have some information about some of the MIA cases we're working on. But he couldn't find any of this. So to this day, we still don't know what happened to Rivers or Bacon. Patrick Renfrans, like a lot of us, was born after World War II, but he had an uncle who flew a B-24 that was shot down over Yap Island. The plane was never found. We don't know what happened to the crew. But, every year you'd be at Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? And it always came up about Uncle so-and-so and his B-24 that disappeared. And on the mantelpiece, there was a photograph of his uncle, and that was sort of like a little memorial because they didn't really know what happened to him. So as he grew up and he got older, he decided he'd take a trip out to Yap Island, see if he could find his uncle's B-24. He never did, but 30 years later, he's still going out there. But he's finding aircraft that went missing and then notifying DPAA. And he's been very involved in the Historic Preservation Office out there. And so they set up this sort of a memorial trail where they have a little history of what happened there and photographs of aircraft that shot down. But he has a website called Missing Aircrew, so if you're at all interested. And over the years, he's made contact with the widows and other family members of the other crew members. So it's worth looking into. I'm not going to say much about this project recovery. Dr. Pat Scanlon, he used to live down the road from me in California. I met him at a history conference in Fredericksburg. My book about Saipan had just come out. For whatever reason, he had a copy already, found out I was there, and he found me out. We've been connecting ever since. I've never been on any of his expeditions yet, but he goes back into the Palau Islands every year. He went out there originally just to scuba dive, look at the pretty fish, look at the corals, and then he found the wing of an airplane. And he thought, wow, what's this? And so now when he goes out there, he doesn't look for pretty fish. He's looking for aircraft. And I will say no more about that because I'm running out of time. But if you come back here tomorrow evening at 5:30, a Hollywood producer did a 1 hour and 20-minute documentary on the work that Pat Scanlon and his Project Recovery have been doing in the Palau Islands. And it goes a long ways to flesh out some of the things that I can only touch on in my lecture. And also about 20 years ago, before that documentary was made, one of the people in his crew made a documentary called The Last Flight Home, because that's in the days when all they had was a GPS, and they went out in the jungle with machetes. Or they would go with scuba gear in lagoons and have a boat drag them around. Now they're using ground-penetrating radar and underwater robotics. But I don't want to say more because otherwise I'll have to cut this short. But if you come back, the documentary is called To What Remains, and I think you'll find it worth watching. Of course, I have to mention the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency in Honolulu. They do a lot of important work. And I want to mention at least one Australian story because I have a friend, he's getting ready to leave Rabaul now. That is David Flynn. He's from New Zealand. He's lived out in Papua New Guinea, area for over 50 years. He speaks the lingo. He's had a couple of local wives and about 5,000 kids. Got to be a reason for going out there and living, right? But anyway, he knows more about the fighting that took place around New Britain, especially Rabaul. His yard looks like a World War II museum site. But the fellow in the middle, that's Jim Burroughs. He's 101 years old. He's the last surviving member of the Australian Coast Watchers in that part of the world. He was up in the Baining Mountains above Rabaul for the last 15 months of the war, and after it was over, they got him out of there really fast. But he's connected to Rabaul in another way because his older brother, Robert Burroughs, was part of Lark Force. That was a 1,400-man force that Australia sent to Rabaul to protect the place. Well, what the Japanese sent in 8,000 men with their airplanes and their ships. All they had was small arms, a few pieces of artillery. Didn't have anything in the way of the Air Force except some PBY Catalinas, which got shot down, some Hudson bombers, some Wirraways, which weren't really fighters, they were trainer planes. But anyway, when the Japanese landed, they put up some fight, and others escaped into the jungle. Some actually made it back to Port Moresby and eventually to Australia. Some surrendered down the coast at a place called Toll Plantation, but instead of being made prisoners of war, they were taken out into the jungle one by one and bayoneted to death. Others who surrendered were held prisoners. They were put on the Montevideo Maru along with some Australian civilians. They were set sailing supposedly for Hainan Island just north of Luzon when an American submarine torpedoed the ship, and all 1,000+ Australians went down with the ship because they were locked in the hold. Now, the story doesn't end there because he had a twin brother, Thomas Burroughs. He was flying out of Goodenough Island on bow fighters. There were 5 of them. They were going to attack a Japanese airstrip in Gasmata on the south coast of New Britain. They never made it. His twin brother, that was his first mission, and it was his last. They don't know what happened to it. They suspect they ran into a severe weather system and they just disappeared over the ocean someplace. So if you can imagine his parents, of the 3 sons, he's the only one who made it back. And of the other 2, they're still listed as missing in action. We know, though, a year or 2 ago, they found the remains of the Montevideo Maru. So that at least they know where the ship is, but of course it's considered a war grave. So the Australians that are entombed there will stay there. I have to talk a little bit about Brigadier General Kenneth Walker. He's one of the highest-ranking American MIAs from World War II. He was in the Army Air Force during World War I. He stayed in. He was part of what they call the Bomber Mafia. He was going to really help make the U.S. Army Air Force something more modern than what it was in World War I when they were flying planes made of wood and fabric. So he was an innovator with some of the new technology and especially some of the theories about how air forces would be used in the next war. Of course, these bomber guys, they thought, without even having proved it, that we could fight a war without armies because these big 4-engine bombers would go over and they would decimate the enemy and they would get up. We wouldn't even need to send in the army. Of course, that was a bunch of bullshit. Didn't work. They still had to sell in the army. But he was part of General Kennedy's 5th Air Force under General MacArthur. And he was a hands-on kind of guy because in the early days of the war, we didn't have much of an Air Force. Certainly MacArthur didn't. He had a few old beat-up B-24s, maybe some B-25s. Eventually, his Air Force got bigger and better. But in those days, they were trying to take the war to the enemy. And Rabaul, here on the northeast coast of New Britain, was the main Japanese base in the area. So they were sending a few planes over in daylight and trying to cause some damage. But they were losing some of them because the Japanese had fighter planes there. They had anti-aircraft batteries. Well, anyway, General Kennedy told General Walker he did not, number one, want any more daylight operations against Rabaul until we could build up our forces. Number two, he definitely did not want General Walker to go on any more missions because he was a hands-on kind of guy. He didn't like sending his boys out into harm's way while he sat back someplace in Melbourne. So he was going on some of these missions. But General Kennedy said no more of that. Well, he disobeyed orders on both counts. He went on a B-17, the San Antonio Rose. The best information we had, they came in from the north. The Japanese knocked out one of his engines with anti-aircraft fire. And as he headed south towards Wide Bay, over the Benin Mountains, a Japanese fighter shot him down. We think, though, that one of the gunners might also have shot down the fighter. But anyway, he crashed somewhere in that area, maybe Wide Bay, maybe someplace on land. According to David Flynn, we know that there are a number of planes in that area, but the Chinese loggers have gone in there, and they don't like people coming up messing around, so they hire some of the local tribes to chase people away. But Dave has friends in the area, and when the loggers, if they find an aircraft, and they're not interested in the aircraft, they'll just bulldoze it out of the way. So he has friends in some of the villages who will try to recover what they can. But anyway, he's still listed as missing in action. They've never found the plane. 2 people in his plane bailed out. They were eventually captured, but then they were executed. But I've been in contact with one of his sons for some time, and they have a General Kenneth Walker Museum someplace back in the Midwest, too. And this is David Flynn and his latest wife. But they're getting ready to move to Australia pretty soon. And Dave, this is a makeshift museum they have there. And Dave says he thinks this might be the plane that shot down San Antonio Rose because it was shot down the same day as the San Antonio Rose, but we don't know that for sure. Here's another piece of the wing. And like I said, Chinese loggers up there are a bit of an issue. They don't want anybody snooping around, and they don't give a damn about missing aircraft, so they just bulldoze them out of the way. I have to talk a little bit about Verdun because Verdun has nothing to do with World War II at all. It has nothing to do with the Pacific War. But Verdun was what some historians refer to as a war within a war because this took place in France in 1916. And for 10 months, the French and the Germans stood toe-to-toe and murdered each other. When it was all over, they counted something like 800,000 dead. This is one battle, and it accomplished nothing. They just killed each other. Matter of fact, before I got married, my wife, who was from France, we were visiting her paternal grandparents. And we said we were going to go see Verdun, and her paternal grandfather said his father died there. Not only that, but they had 3 other members of the family who died at Verdun. I don't think there was a family in France who was not touched by what happened at Verdun. And in the 1930s, they built a memorial to all those who died at Verdun. There's a huge cemetery out there. On the ground floor, they have all these plexiglass windows. And you look in there, and these are the skeletal remains of an estimated 160,000 individuals. We don't know if they're German, we don't know if they're France, they're all mixed together. So if there are over 70,000 Americans still listed as missing in action from World War II alone, just think this one battle. And I've been out there 3 different times. I've talked to some of the historians, the docents out there, and they're saying things like, well, there are still parts of the battlefield you can't go there. They're all fenced off because of the unexploded ammunition. If you were to walk through Verdun with a magnetic compass, it would not point to magnetic north because there's still so much iron in the ground. I've even been to these pits where shells have exploded, and I'd see little white things in there, pick them up to little tiny bone fragments. People were just obliterated in that fight. So I always like to bring Verdun into this lecture as a sort of compare and contrast. So as horrific as World War II was in terms of American losses and American missing in action, just think from World War I, just from this one battle. So I like to use that for compare and comparison. Okay, now like I mentioned, a lot of the aircraft we lost were operational. I would say we lost more planes operationally than we did in combat. A lot of them were just in training missions. Now in Taranaki, where I live, Oxford disappeared in 1943. They just didn't know what happened to it. They thought, well, it must have crashed into the Tasman Sea or something. But in 1974, a goat hunter in the Puakais, and they're not very high, but that's low down below Mount Taranaki. My house is a little bit off the screen, but he was up there hunting goats and found the crash site of the Oxford. And there are still skeletal remains in the wreckage. And there were family members from the area who were still around. And there's a little museum not by, and they put some of the parts of that in there. And I want to talk a little bit about MIA recovery versus relic hunters, because there's money to be made in artifacts from World War I, World War II. I understand people are still collecting and selling artifacts from Vietnam now, too. But the relic hunters, when they go in there, they find stuff and then they want to sell it. But I talked to a fellow in Ardmore outside of Auckland. That was the airfield during the war. They still have some of the big hangars there. And he had an operation there where he was buying old World War II stuff that people had found in the Solomon Islands and elsewhere. He was buying it and then selling it to collectors. But they were also, especially wanted old aircraft parts. And there's some, if they were good enough, they could use them and try to rebuild aircraft. And they were selling them for millions of dollars. So he gave me a tour, but I asked him, well, when they find these aircraft, what if there are skeletal remains there? Do they notify the proper authorities? Because if they disturb it, basically they are disturbing a war grave. And he wouldn't answer me. Matter of fact, my interview was over right there. He didn't want to talk about it. But that's going on in Australia and other places. People are going out finding aircraft. There's money to be made there. Why notify the authorities and slow down the process? Because there's human remains. So it's great that they recover this stuff and they can put them in museums for future generations. But if it's a war grave, not real happy about that. But I'm wrapping this up now. On my website, under links, there are a number of people that I network with on AMIA and other Pacific War issues. If you're from Australia, Peter Dunn in Melbourne, he has an outstanding website called Oz at War. Just about, he works on it full time, he's retired. Just anything you want to know about Australia in the Pacific War, you can probably find it on his website. Justin Talon, PacificRex.com, and he has a search engine. If you want to find a name, a type of plane, an island, a battle, go in there and punch it in. He might have answers for you. I have Ted Darcy here. The only thing is, I wrote to Ted Darcy a few weeks ago. I had a question about a possible MIA from, I guess I'd met on the previous cruise, but he never got back to me, so I don't even know if he's still around. Pat Scannon, the Project Recovery. You can go to some of these places. Go on my website, voicesfromthepacificwar.com. You'll find some of my articles and other information. Plus, you will find links to people who might be able to answer some questions that you might have. Oh, I became a grandfather last May. That's the reason I want this cruise to end, so I get back. But I have the stuff about Australia and New Zealand. There's just not enough time. But if I do an Australia and New Zealand audience, I have to put these back in. So that's just a teaser. So please, 5:30 here, To What Remains. It's a 1 hour, 20-minute documentary. You won't regret it. See you later.